Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another Cybersecurity Reloaded workshop by the Q Project. Thank you to everyone that was able to make it today for the workshop. Today's workshop is going to be talking about authentication and giving you a little insight into how widespread it is used for the internet, since almost everything on the internet has some form of authentication to make sure that users are legit and there's no bad troubles. So the first thing is, what is authentication? Authentication is a process to determine if someone is who they say they are. So just like in real life, you don't want people having access to buildings if you don't know them. So that's why there's passwords and passcodes pretty much everywhere you go, and locks on doorknobs and all that. And in technology, authentication is used to create a system or a program that checks credentials and matches them to credentials that are inside a database or a server. So most companies usually have it in databases now, but in the old days, they used to have just a server with your website or a server with a program, and that same server would have a program that authenticated users. But since so many people use the internet nowadays, a lot of these matching credentials happen in a database where you put your login and your passcode into a website like Google, and they check it with their database to ensure that it's correct. So the next part of this is to show the difference between authorization and authentication. They're both used, but sometimes people talk about them as if they're the same thing. But authentication is used to prove identity and see if you are the person you're saying you are. Authorization is used alongside that to prove what you have the right to access. So a user might have authentication to log into a website, but he might not have the authorization to access the root files of that website. So those are the differences. One is what you can do, the other is who you are. And so the next part of authentication, this is a good part to know, is the authentication factors. So all an authentication factor is just a category of, or it's just categories splitting up the different ways to authenticate yourself. And there's three main ones that are reliable. One of them is the knowledge factor, and it's something you know. So we use this every day. It's usernames, passwords. It's something that you know and other people don't know. A possession factor is something that you have. So you see a lot of people using these nowadays. You have smart cards or USBs that can go into your laptop or your PC, and they can authenticate you along with your username and your password. You got security tokens too. Those are things that websites can give you. So if you log into a website, they can give you a token, and you can use that token to continually get access. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. And the last authentication factor is inheritance factors. And this is a biometric characteristic. So you see this a lot on phones nowadays, and even laptops. You have fingerprint, voice, iris patterns, like iPhone's eye scanner for like Face ID. Those are all inheritance factors because they authenticate who you are based on something that is on your body. And another thing to touch on is the difference between using those factors. And so looking back at it, you might see that you either use only one of these, or you've seen websites that require you to use both of these. There's even ones where, like, say you're logging to your bank account on your iPhone. A lot of the times they give you the option to sign up with a username and password, and then use your Face ID or Touch ID to log you in as well. And this goes into single factor and multi-factor authentication. So single factor is just based on one category, like in the name. And what some people don't know is that just having a username and password is single factor authentication, because both of those fall into the knowledge factor category. So just having a username and password is a basic form of authentication. But nowadays, since things are more and more focused on security and protecting yourself, a lot of devices, websites, people look to use multi-factor authentication. And this basically just means you're using more than one of these categories at once. And a lot of websites will call this two-factor authentication, or like 2FA. And you can see this when you're logging into Instagram or Facebook, any of those large websites, and they give you the option to send yourself a text or a phone call with a code when you log in. That there is two-factor, because your username password acts as the knowledge factor, and your iPhone or your Android phone acts as a possession factor because it's something you have. This also can happen through authentication apps, which is an easy way to do it. If you're here at the UC Merced or some other UCs that use it, we use Duo to log into our website or our student ID, and that is an authenticator app. It adds an extra layer of authentication. And you can see that here on our login screen. It says two-factor authentication right there with Duo. Duo is the app. And this also, single sign-on, is actually a feature for authentication, because in large organizations, the goal is to prevent unauthorized access. So you don't want people having the ability to log in as someone else without that person knowing. So that the whole goal is to protect against that. But for companies that have tons of programs or systems that they give access to, it would be quite annoying for the end user, like one of us, to have to log in every time we want to access something different. So that's why large organizations will give you a single sign-on, and it's a login credential that only allows you, it gives you one username and password, but access to multiple systems. So here with the UC Merced single sign-on, what happens is we have our UCM ID and we have our password along with the Duo authentication. And once you log in and you're authenticated, you're in for all the services. So you can check your transcripts, you can pay your bills, you can go on CAT courses, you can check your email. All those are different services, and they're all accessed with one username and password. And that's what single sign-on is. And moving on to some more authentication ideas, I'm going to go back to the token-based authentication. So if you look at the beginning of pretty much every single website that you load, it's going to have HTTP or HTTPS. These are web application protocols, and they're stateless, which means that they don't hold additional information. So once you sign into a website, it's not going to save that you logged into the website. So if you refresh pages, it will put you back to square one. It will make you sign in again. But you might be wondering how come that doesn't actually happen in real life. And it's because of token-based authentication. So once you log into a website, the server that is hosting that website will give you a token, and your client will use that token every time it sends a request. So if you're logging into YouTube, or a better one would be email. If you're logging into an email, it's going to give you a token once you log in. And as long as you keep that website open and you're going through it, checking emails and all that, every time you want to check something, say you want to send a message, it's going to send a token along with that request to send an email out to someone. And then the server will know, okay, this token belongs to this person. I'm going to allow access without them needing to log in again. And this diagram can kind of show how that's working. So you can see the browser or the client, it's gonna send their username and password over for authentication. The server will check and send back an access token. And then the next time the browser client wants to do something, they will send the token along with their request, whatever that is. And the server can then, instead of checking for the username and password, just see if the token is correct. And if the token's correct, they'll send back whatever information was requested by the client. And this goes into API authentication, where the API stands for Application Programming Interface. All this really means is that large companies can't program everything by themselves because there's a lot of different applications and functions that people want. So what can happen is if someone wants to have a website that hosts a large platform's data on it, they can use APIs, and that allows them to access a company's information without using their web browser. So an API basically allows a server to send pure data responses to a client. So if you want to use an API, say for YouTube, and you want a YouTube video on your web page, what you can do instead of telling your user, hey, you need to open this link and go watch this YouTube video, you have the ability to use Google's API for YouTube and send a request to send the YouTube video data over to your website. So with a traditional application, this get means that you're getting information from the server or the database that's hosting it, and they're going to send back HTML, because HTML is what displays the graphical interface of a website. So with Google, if you typed in google.com, it's going to say get google.com from their server, and they're going to send back their home screen that we see every day. With APIs, what happens is you're going to say get google.com, but instead of sending back a web page or an HTML graphical interface, it's going to send back the raw data of that website. So most APIs will do this in a format called JSON, which I won't get into today. But it's basically the API will send back plain text to the user, which lets people that are creating programs and websites use that plain text however they feel like. A large or a good example of this is weather APIs. Pretty much every weather company has an API, because one of the basic features of most websites is people want to include the weather on their website. And so if you've ever wondered why a lot of websites just have the weather displayed for you without having to go somewhere else to access it, it's because they're using APIs. They're just requesting what temperature it is currently from the weather app, and the weather app is sending the temperature rather than sending back an app or a full-fledged website. And the authentication sequence for APIs, it's going to be different for every program that you're doing, but this is a somewhat simplistic way of looking at it. And it's actually pretty similar to what this looks like, because you can see here is an API server as well. So here, there's the user, the web app. So this would be what you're creating. This could be either a website, an iPhone app, something, a server, whatever you want it to be. And REST backend, you don't have to worry about this. This is basically just a structure for how to set up an API so that it works good. So how the sequence will work is the user sends over login and password, and then the web app can go ahead and log in and then submit credentials for a token to the API. The API can send tokens, and then every time the user wants to do something, the web app can access that API using the token from the user. and get a reply and display it for the user on the web page. So using the weather example, this could be the Weather Channel, the company that most people are familiar with. This would be the Weather Channel's API. This would be a website that you want to have functionality for, and this would be a user. The user would log in and say there's a button on the website that says, I want to see the current weather. The user can click it, and then that web app can go ahead and work with the Weather Channel to send raw data of the weather back, and then the user can see it. And that's kind of the basics of how the APIs work. And what I also want to talk about today is Spotify's web API, because music streaming services are a really good example for understanding how an API works, because a lot of time you want to have music, but you don't want to be inside the app. So you can see that a lot of web pages and websites implement Spotify into their programs and their applications. So if you've ever seen where there's like a mini player for Spotify or a mini player for Apple Music inside of another program, that's using an API. And I think if you guys use Genius, the music app, you'll see that they have a mini player for Apple Music, and that is an API, but it's using Apple's API. And basically why I want to bring this up is that for my next workshop that I'll be teaching, I'm going to be going more in depth of what the Spotify web API is capable of doing, because this was a summer project of mine and I wanted to be able to learn it and show it while I'm learning. So right here, all I did was look up Spotify API, and this is the Spotify for Developers website, and it explains basically how their web API works. So you have tons of abilities that you can do with an API, but if you go all the way to the bottom of this page, you'll see the first step is that to use their API, you need authentication. Because what would happen without authentication in an API is that someone could create a program, say using Python, that would be pretty simple, and it would just constantly access Spotify saying, hey, I want this song, I want this artist, like send data. And without authentication, Spotify doesn't know who's asking for that information. So if you want to use their API just like any other API, they require you to authenticate yourself as you request the data, just like you would if you were logging into a website like google.com. And their website lists all their guides for how to authenticate. There's basically two forms. There's the app authorization and then the user authorization. Or actually, this here is authorization for authentication. So if you remember, I was talking about the differences between them. So after you authenticate yourself, this is explaining the authorization. And the reason why you need authorization is so that, say you want to access a user's album, say I myself want to display my R&B album on the front page of my website, I wouldn't be able to access my own profile's playlists without having user authorization. So I have to authorize that I'm the correct user to Spotify, and then they'll send the data over. That's what authorization means in this sense. And this is the whole authorization flow for Spotify. And in the upcoming weeks, I'll be learning more and more about this so that I can come back and explain exactly how this all works and how you can actually use their API to get useful information and then display the information. And aside from that, this was my presentation for today. I have sources listed here if you would like to look at these websites and read more about the information. But other than that, thank you all for coming to the workshop. We have our workshops every week for those that don't know. So continually look for every Thursday. There'll be a Q project workshop. And thank you again